You're going to meet my expectations. You have out your journal with your very first entry, which is called Base Camp. And you have a pencil out and you're going to have paper out for notes. I'm going to come around and check off all of your Base Camp drawings. And then we'll move on with our lesson today. All right, so after having checked off all of your Base Camp journal entries, we're going to go ahead and start with our classification of plants. This is going to be our first introductory lesson to the whole plant kingdom, or kingdom Plantae. We've come a long way through science so this year. If you look at those domains, we looked at bacteria and Eukaryota, and we talked about archaea. So with bacteria, we finished that one. And it also really encompassed archaea. Remember that archaebacteria are the old bacteria that are able to use some chemical things that other living things are not. That has led us to Eukaryota. And with the domain Eukaryota, or eukaryotes, we already looked at protista and fungi. Remember that eukaryotes are organisms, either one cell or unicellular or multicellular, that have a nucleus in their cell. They have these really organized cells that have bound organelles that have a nucleus that's controlling everything. Unlike the bacteria, remember that those were prokaryotes, and those cells have no nucleus, and they aren't going to have all of those organelles. They do have ribosomes, they have cytoplasm, but they're not going to have like the Golgi bodies and all of those other things that a eukaryotic cell would have. So now for the rest of this year, we are solely going to focus on eukaryotes, okay? Cells with nuclei. And we started with those microscopic ones, the protists, and they are the simplest eukaryotes that are one of the most simple eukaryotes on the planet. We then looked at fungi, which were going to be multicellular, but they're still extremely simple organisms, okay? So from there, we cross out protista, we cross out fungi, and that leads us to Plantae. I'm not sure what this other line coming out of Plantae is for, but anyway. All right. So before we can even start talking about taxonomy and start talking about placement of plants and all those other kinds of things, we have to first establish what makes an organism a plant. Okay, what is a plant? So I would pause the video right now and I would write that question down in your notes and make sure that it's a nice big title. What makes a plant? Do that right now. The first thing that would make something qualify as a plant, and I think this is a big one, is the fact that it has chlorophyll. Chlorophyll, it's that green pigmenting that we can see in plants. Remember that chlorophyll is what makes it possible for it to undergo photosynthesis. And when we were looking at the protists, there were those protists that were plant-like that also were able to do photosynthesis. We had the ones that were the green in color. And then we had that euglena that was kind of like a plant, but it also behaved like an animal as well, but it was green in color. So underneath what makes a plant, the first characteristic you want to write down is simply that it has chlorophyll, which is a green pigment. Pause the video now and write that down. All right, the second thing that makes a plant is that it is multicellular. Okay, this is going to be a huge reason why those protists that were plant-like were not going to fit into the kingdom Plantae. They were put in that hodgepodge group. Remember we talked about them being the misfits and the hodgepodge. They were single cellular or unicellular. In order to be characterized as a plant or a member of kingdom Plantae, you have to be multicellular, and many cells squished and bound together are organized into what we call tissue. So you start with a single cell, then you get a bunch of cells together, and that makes tissue. And here's that definition. Groups of similar cells that perform a specific function in an organism. Pause the video right now and add that number 2. Be sure that you add the word tissues and you add that definition for the word tissue. All right, so because the plant is made of chlorophyll, like we said for number 1, that's going to lead us to the third characteristic, which is the fact that a plant, in order to be a plant, an organism must be autotrophic or autotrophic, which means it's going to make their own food. And the way that they do this is through the process of photosynthesis, okay? Photosynthesis. And so, what you're going to see is this chemical equation that comes up right here, and it's going to show you the ingredients. It's going to show you what powers the change, and then it's going to show you the results. So let's look at this up close together. So first of all, the ingredients. We have to kind of jog our memory back to chemistry when we talked a little bit about that, and we talked about elements. And we talked about the fact that C stands for carbon, O stands for oxygen, and then it'll tell you how many of those. So when the number comes down, we call it subscript, and it's down beneath the letter. We call that that there's 2 atoms of oxygen. So ignore this 6 right here in front of us and just look at the fact that you have, so we're not looking at that, we're just looking at the C, O, and 2. What that's telling you is 1 carbon and 2 oxygen. So carbon dioxide, okay? Carbon dioxide is what we exhale, and we've talked about this before. But what this 6 is going to tell you is that there's 6 of these molecules. Remember, molecules is when you have more than 2 atoms bound together. So there's 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. You're going to add 6 molecules of H2O, which is water. So 6 molecules of water, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, have those all together, and they're existing inside of that plant. Now, in order for there to be a chemical reaction, you have to have something that fuels or powers it. Your car is not going to go, and the gasoline is going to do nothing unless there's some kind of a reaction that happens that ignites that gasoline and gets it to go. Same thing here. There's got to be an energy that fuels this process. And our energy source here is solar energy. Okay, sun energy, light power. And so when you have this CO2 and this water, these 12 molecules, because 6 and 6 of each together, and they are ignited or powered by solar energy, photosynthesis then takes place and you have results. Results is what you're left with. So, you mix all these ingredients together, you're going to get something. And we've talked about how chemistry is like a big baker's pantry, and you kind of take this and this and you mix it all together and hey, you got a cake. Well, kind of the same idea. The results after photosynthesis are called byproducts. Byproducts, that means results. And what you get is you get glucose, which is sugar, and you get oxygen, which is what we breathe. Okay? You say, well, wait a second, Mrs. Burton. How are you going to get sugar and oxygen from carbon dioxide and water? Well, you know that during a chemical reaction, we've talked about this. I think this is I'm not sure if it's the first law of thermodynamics or the law of, oh goodness, physics is not my best subject. But our conservation of mass is what we're talking about. And what that's going to tell us is we're neither going to create or destroy mass in a chemical process. And so all of these atoms over here have to exist in some form over here. And so when you look at that, you say, hey, those are the same. They're just kind of rearranged. How many oxygens did we have on the ingredient side? Well, we had 6 of O2, so 2 times 6 is 12. So we had 12 oxygens in that one. Plus, how many oxygens did we have in the water one? We had 6. So that's going to give us how many? 12 and 6 is 18. How many oxygens do we have on this side? We have 6 right here. And then we have 6 O2, which is going to be 12. That gives us 18 again. So they just rearranged. You still have the same thing on the other side. Same with the carbon and same with the hydrogen. And once those atoms have rearranged themselves and rebonded in different groups, you come out with sugar, which right here, which is what feeds the plant. And then the plant gives off this other byproduct because it doesn't want the oxygen. And that basically provides our air for us. That's that whole really cool partnership that we have. We breathe out CO2 for the plants take it in and say thank you very much, and then they give out O2, which is the oxygen that we breathe. Take a few minutes right now to pause the video, write down the concept of photosynthesis, write down number 3 that it's autotrophic, and go ahead and you need to write down this entire equation, and you need to write down all of these things around it. I would be guilty of writing more than not enough. Take all the time you need right now to pause this and write all of this down. And if you're asking, man, I wonder if I'm going to be responsible for this equation, absolutely you will be. All right, so now you've got that down. Here's just another nice little picture that kind of shows you the same thing. You don't need to write anything down for this one. Just use your visuals. You've got your water here and your carbon dioxide. We do light power here and that chlorophyll. And then that's going to give us our sugar, which is this glucose, which will feed the plants. And then the oxygen for us to breathe. Again, down here, you've got the chemical equation rewritten for you again, and they kind of put it by what it actually makes, like water, sugar, oxygen, etc. All right, so now we need to ask ourselves, okay, we know what makes a plant. If an organism has those 3 characteristics, it's definitely a plant. But what do these plants need to survive? Okay, so I would take a time in just a minute when I ask you to pause this video to go ahead and write down that key question. What do plants, need to survive? We already know they're alive. We know they're in the kingdom Plantae. We need to know what they need in order to stay alive. Number 1, they have to obtain water and nutrients. They can't get water, that H2O, they can't make their food, and their leaves will shrivel up. So water is an absolute must, and so are those nutrients. Number 2, they've got to be able to retain that water. It's not enough for them to take the water in at the roots, and we're going to talk a whole lot about that in later lessons, about which parts of the plant take the water in, which parts of the plant do this and that. But they're going to have to be able to retain that water, because retaining that water keeps their leaves moist, it keeps their leaves flexible, and it also supplies the water for photosynthesis. Number 3, they have to have body support. Plants have to grow up depending upon the plant. Some grow bigger, some grow smaller. They've got to have body support that will support the weight as they grow up. And they don't have a skeleton like we think of, so they've got to have something there that supports their body. And we'll talk more about that as well. Number 4, they have to be able to transport materials through the body. And I use that word body kind of like in quotes because we think of body like ourselves, but they really are a body too. And later on, we're going to talk about the similarities between the human body and a plant. And one of those things is transporting materials. But if the roots are taking water in, you've got to get those up through the plant and into the leaves and up to the flowers and all those things. So they have to have some kind of a transport system. Another thing they need to survive, they've got to be able to reproduce. And we've talked about how important reproduction is. If an organism fails to reproduce, and a bunch of those organisms stop being able to reproduce, a species will then become endangered and then threatened and then endangered. And then if they all cease to reproduce, they then go extinct. So reproduction's huge. So take a few minutes, pause this video, and write down these 5 characteristics, or these 5 things that need underneath the title, what do they need to survive? All right, so now that we kind of know what they need, we know that they're alive, we know what makes an organism a plant, we're going to talk about classification, or the taxonomy. Okay, and I told you that taxonomy was going to be with us for the rest of the year, and that is especially the case with plants. So I would draw like a little subheading in your notes and write the word classification. And if you are so inclined, use that word taxonomy again. That's a higher level vocabulary word. Pause the video and do that right now, and we'll move on. All right, let's talk about where we are with those. We have the domain Eukaryota, the kingdom Plantae, okay? There are 4 phyla. Kingdom, phylum, you know, if you remember back to when I had you memorize that order, you go domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Well, we're down to the 3rd thing, the phyla, okay? The first phyla that we have are the Bryophytes, and these are mosses. Go ahead and take a second to go ahead and write this stuff in. Go ahead and write this like this, and then do your branch out and add your first phyla. That is Bryophytes. Pause the video right here if you need to do that. The second phyla of plants are going to be Pteridophyta. These are going to be your ferns. Okay, and we're going to talk about how we go from here to here to here, and we get 1, and we get 2, and then we're going to get 3 and 4. We're going to talk about that, again, that dichotomous key where it's either this or this, and we're going to keep going down, and I'll show you how that works in just a little bit. Number 3, you have Gymnosperms, and they are known as the naked seeds. Don't get excited. It's not as fun as that sounds. Gymnosperms. And then lastly, number 4 are going to be your angiosperms, and these are going to be your flowers and your fruit. So go ahead and pause the video right now. Make sure you have all of these written down, and then we'll pick up with that. All right, so the very first section of our dichotomous key, whether it's going to be this or this, the first one is it non-vascular or is it vascular? These are your 2 choices. And so we take every single plant in the whole entire world and we put them into these 2 groups. And so the first one is non-vascular, and the only plants that will go into this group are going to be your Bryophytes. Okay? Every single other plant goes into the vascular section. Okay? Bryophytes. All right, so what are Bryophytes? What are non-vascular plants? What does that mean? If you think of the word vascular, you should maybe think of, oh, I've heard vascular surgeon before, or my vascular system. It is a transport system, and in humans, it's going to transport our oxygen and our blood and all those kinds of things in our veins and arteries. But in plants, vascular is going to be something that transport things in plants, not exactly the same as what we have. Non-vascular plants are not going to have a transport system. Okay, they do not have vascular tissue, and because of that, they don't have support, and they don't have conduction of materials. So if there's no way to move materials through its body, and it can't support weight, then what kind of plants are these going to be? They're Bryophytes, obviously, and they're going to be these plants that just kind of lay. They're very low to the ground. They don't get very big, and they have to basically lay in a moist environment because that's the only way they can get their water. Okay? They have no stems. So we're looking at things like mosses. Okay? These non-vascular plants cannot grow as tall. They have to be in direct contact with moisture because they can't transport it. The way they move these materials is by diffusion from cell to cell. I would pause the video or go back if you can and write all of those things down. I kind of got a little bit ahead of myself clicking through. So here's a nice picture of some mosses, and notice they're lying on this rock, and we see mossy rocks all the time. And what they basically do is they suck the moisture out of the rocks. They will literally dissolve a rock as they're lying there. Mosses, it's also liverworts and hornworts. Now, one things that I want you to notice right here is this word wart. It's not wart, W-A-R-T, like those little things, growths on your body that you go, oh, gross, I don't like these. Totally different. It's wart, and wort is an Old English name for plant. So it's basically just saying a liver plant or a horn plant, okay? These bryophytes are mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. They are seedless. They reproduce by spores, and these are what they would look like. Very low to the ground. They're like ground covers, and they have to lay in that moist environment. Go ahead and pause the video and write these things down. This is really cool. They started growing these walls of moss, and they are about, what, 3.8 yards, it says right there. And what they say is that where they have these walls of mosses, because they're plants, that they're cleaning the urban air in the cities. So they say that these mosses can clean up as much as 275 trees. You know, I haven't done the research on that, and I haven't investigated it. That's a pretty great claim. And if that's the case, that was a brilliant discovery and invention to put these moss walls around. They're pretty and they're functional. Obviously, if they're cleaning air, that's really a neat concept. Okay, here's some more pictures of those mosses. Liverworts just are these like real flat looking, I guess they look like livers if you took a leaf out, and then these little hornworts. All right, so now a moss has different parts. You say, well, how can it be that complex? I mean, look at this thing. It's just laying there, but it does. And so if you look right here, that's going to be your capsule, okay? Then you have the stem-looking thing. Remember, it's not a stem, but it kind of looks like it, and it's called a seta. And then they have little leaves down there, okay? The little leaves, and those are going to be responsible for photosynthesis. And so then they have this main axis, which is it's like a root. And then they have these rhizoids, which are hairy-looking things that are kind of like roots as well. And so you can section this into two things. You have the sporophyte, which is going to be the reproductive part of the plant. And then you have the gametophyte, which is the mature part of the plant. So right here would be your gametophyte right there. And then these things up here are your sporophytes. And yes, you guessed it. You need to pause the video right now, and you need to draw this diagram and label it in your notes under mosses or bryophytes. All right, this just shows you the reproduction cycle of a bryophyte. You don't have to draw this because you just did on your other page, but this gives you a little colorful visual of that. The gametophyte is the mature part of the plant, and it produces the sporophyte. And the sporophyte has the spores in there, and what these things will fall, and then the cycle will just continue. Oh, there you go. I didn't realize I already had those little cool arrows on there.